Hello, everyone. In this mini lecture, we're going to learn about neuroanatomy and function, which is to say, we're going to learn about different parts of the nervous system and the brain, their functions, and connect it all to your life and real life applications in general. A note here, I will say that as you learn about this sometimes very dense material that can feel like psychology, biology, and a foreign language, try to visualize it as much as possible. I have course resources for you that include different apps that you can download onto your phone or websites that you can go to visualize these different structures and therefore learn more about them. So why study neuroanatomy? There's many reasons why you'd want to do this. One is that the nervous system is the system in your body that controls all other systems, the circulatory system, the respiratory system, the immune system, etc. So it's a very important part of our anatomy. All your behavior, often complex, sometimes simple, emerges from coordinated neural function. And these brain and nervous circuits are modifiable. That's the good news. You have some influence over them. And so we're going to learn about these different structures and connect them to your life and have some tips in there that will allow you to make the most of neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to change with experience. Let's start with the central and peripheral nervous system. As you can see here in this picture, we have the brain and spinal cord. That's the central nervous system. And then, which is, of course, your command center, where all the information comes in to and all the decisions come out of. So that's central command, the brain and spinal cord. They are, of course, connected to your peripheral nervous system, which is a vast network of neural tissue outside of your skull and your spine. So basically, all the nerves throughout your body. Your peripheral nervous system connects your body and brain to your mind, right? Your brain and mind here in the central nervous system to your body, all the nerves that go out to the periphery. The peripheral nervous system is made up of both afferent, meaning sensory nerve fibers that bring in information like sight, sound, touch, smell, taste into your brain so you can taste that delicious chocolate or see that gorgeous sunset, as well as motor or efferent fibers, which are fibers that relay commands from the brain to your body. So, for example, picking up this water bottle was affected by a motor neuron that received instructions from my brain saying, pick up that water bottle. Connecting this to specific neurodegenerative disorders, for example, multiple sclerosis or MS. I got this case study from the British MS Society that features some young individuals living with MS. MS can affect anyone of any age and background. And this is a case of Brianne Campbell, who's only 24 and living with MS. When she was first diagnosed, she asked, how long do I have to take this medication for? Not thinking that it was for life. And then finally coming to terms with her condition through mostly maintaining a positive attitude and taking it one day at a time. What is MS and what's the connection with the nervous system? MS attacks the myelin sheath of the CNS. This is the fatty insulation around the axons of neurons that keep the electrical signal traveling fast and accurate between your synapses. So basically, it's a fatty layer like the rubber around the wires in your house that keep information processing, keep the integrity of information processing in your nervous system. Of course, the central nervous system is involved in both sensory and motor functions, right? Sensing the world around you as well as moving your body. And so MS will impact many of those functions depending on the person: numbness, tingling, lack of coordination, slurred speech, blurry vision, fatigue, etc. This is a diagram of your central nervous system, so your brain and your spinal cord, and the myelin wrapped around a typical axon. In MS, your immune system attacks its own body, damaging the myelin sheath. Another way to highlight how the nervous system is beautifully designed, um, it is highly protected by many things, including the thick bone of your skull, one of the thickest in your body, many immune functions, including microglia that protect your central nervous system. Another way in which the brain and the spinal cord are protected is through what we call the meninges. The meninges are these protective layers around both the brain and the spinal cord, and they're stacked into 3 different layers. If you were to open up your skull, as in this diagram here, we would see the first layer, which is the dura mater, meaning the toughest layer. It's this tough, leathery layer. That's the first one that kind of separates bone from your brain and the other subsequent layers. The next one is the arachnoid. Yes, as in spider, it's spidery, and it removes cerebral spinal fluid from the subarachnoid space into the venous sinuses, so into your bloodstream, basically draining this fluid that your brain is bathed in, as well as your spine, draining it into the blood to flush out toxins and other things. And lastly, we have the pia mater, which is the one that is closest to your brain and surrounds all of the gyri and sulci, tightly adhering to your brain, and as such is highly vascularized, so lots of blood vessels there. A connection to real life is the perhaps would-be tragic case of Aaron Loy, but he was able to turn a nasty bacterial infection that gave him meningitis, so an infection of the meninge layer of the brain. This occurred right here around Santa Barbara in Isla Vista in 2013, where there was an outbreak of meningitis. This can be acquired by touch, through the skin, a kiss, and that was the case of Aaron Loy, who was a UCSB student, a surfer, an athlete, who, like many, succumbed. He didn't pass away, luckily. He just he was infected by this bacteria, causing him to have meningitis and eventually losing 2 of his legs because he got sepsis. His blood became infected and they had to remove the legs. But luckily, Aaron was able to turn his life around and continues to do all kinds of adventurous things. The brain is also protected by what we call the blood-brain barrier, or the BBB. This is basically a wall, if you will, that is made of cells, mostly cells of your capillaries, so these small blood vessels, and the inner lining of them, it has what we call these tight junctions. So basically, these are cells that line the inside of your blood vessels, as you can see in this cross section here on the picture in the bottom, and they are tightly packed. And in addition to that, around those blood vessels, those capillaries, we have an extra layer of astrocytes, which again are glial cells, so the other cells of the nervous system that aren't neurons. And so glial cells, in this case astrocytes, so star-shaped glial cells, add another layer to this blood-brain barrier. And what's the point of this? To keep the brain protected from foreign substances. The blood-brain barrier keeps most chemicals out of the brain. so preventing them from crossing from the blood into the brain and thus causing all kinds of infection, as in the case of meningitis, for example. However, sometimes they're able to cross the barrier and wreak havoc. Typically, very small uncharged particles are able to cross the blood-brain barrier. Fatty substances, oxygen, etc., are able to freely pass, but most other ones, especially large molecules, cannot. One application here is treatment for Parkinson's disease, specifically with what we call levodopa. You may have heard of this if you have a family member or somebody you know with Parkinson's. Levodopa is the standard medication used to treat Parkinson's disease, at least to manage symptoms. And it's interesting because it's a precursor to the neurotransmitter dopamine. And as you may or may not know, dopamine is not just the feel-good pleasure motivation chemical, but it also has a crucial role in motor control, so movement. And as you know, Parkinson's disease is defined by tremors, rigidity of your muscles, lack of coordination, slowness of movement, body posture, etc. And so in the case of Parkinson's disease, as we'll see shortly, we need more dopamine to be produced in key brain areas. However, dopamine cannot cross the blood-brain barrier, and so we cannot just provide people with dopamine orally and have that exert an effect in the brain. And so what we do is given the chemical precursor to dopamine, as you can see here in this blood vessel, typically levodopa, if it's converted to dopamine, and then cannot cross the blood-brain barrier. It's blocked here. But if we just give levodopa and make sure the enzyme that typically breaks it down into dopamine is inhibited, then it can cross the blood-brain barrier and be transformed into dopamine inside the brain to relieve symptoms of Parkinson's, let's say. Continue our tour around the brain. We're going to look at what we call the cerebrum. And I have this handy model here of the brain. You can see here the bigger parts sitting on the cerebellum and the brainstem over here and its blood vessels. And what we call the cerebrum is nothing more than the largest part of the brain. Let's say the walnut halves, if you will. If you just open up the brain, you'll see that the outer part here above these white structures, white matter and subcortical structures, that's the cerebrum. So it's the largest part of the brain, maybe 3/4 of it. And its outer layer, the thinnest part of the cerebrum. So if you get this, look at the cerebrum all the way up to a thin, millimeters thick layer, we call that the cerebral cortex. So the cortex is nothing more than the topmost layer that surrounds most of the brain. And it is divided into 4 different lobes, as you may know. These are the frontal lobe, the largest lobe, and the most developed in mammals, especially humans, have a very large frontal lobe compared to most other species, and is the evolutionarily most recent part of the brain, right? The brain starts to form from the bottom up, and the frontal lobe is the last to form. So it is involved in many functions, including movement in its motor strip, the motor cortex, right next to the central sulcus, or that deep fissure that separates the frontal and parietal lobe. We have a motor strip there that controls movement, but the frontal lobe is also involved in language, decision-making, inhibitory control, etc. Next to it, we have the parietal lobe on the other side of the central sulcus, and there we have a somatosensory strip, just opposite the motor strip. And that means that it's the part of the parietal lobe that receives a lot of the sensation from your body. So touch, temperature, for example, goes to that area so you can become conscious of those sensations. And it is very important in spatial orientation as well, the parietal lobe. Next to it, we have the occipital lobe in the very back of your brain over here. And that area is typically concerned with vision, visual processing. And then, of course, underneath it, right behind your ears, we have the temporal lobes. The temporal lobes are involved in many things, including language, hearing, and memory. Underneath all those structures, under the cerebrum, as I mentioned, we have subcortical structures. So under the cortex and under the cerebrum. And one of them is the hippocampus. This particular structure that's shown here in a normal brain with the hippocampus, and next to it to the right, where holes essentially where the hippocampus was removed in this famous case study that we know as Henry Molaison. Patient HM is a classic study in psychology and neuroscience of neuroanatomy and function. Before HM had his hippocampi on both sides surgically removed, he suffered from intractable epilepsy and constant seizures that were traced to his hippocampus. And so it was surgically removed. However, the result was that he became unable to form new long-term memories called anterograde amnesia. Another important subcortical structure that will tie back to our introduction to Parkinson's disease and the role of dopamine in its treatment is the case study of Michael J. Fox, the renowned actor, Back to the Future, and then many other more recent shows. Fun fact, he recently received the Presidential Medal of Honor for all of the efforts and literally billions, I think $2.5 billion of his money towards Parkinson's research. Of course, he suffers from Parkinson's, young onset Parkinson's at that. He was only 29 years old when he was diagnosed with Parkinson's. Can you imagine? Most people are diagnosed at a later age, usually above 65. There's a correlation with age and onset of symptoms, but he had this particular type of Parkinson's called young onset. So he's lived with Parkinson's more than he has lived without it. We can trace the origins of Parkinson's disease, at least the way it manifests in particular neurotransmitters and brain areas, to a midbrain section. If you were to cut the brain in a midsection, as you can see there in the picture on the diagram, and I'm showing here, you would hit what we call the midbrain and the substantia nigra at that, named for its black color, right? Black substance. That area is packed, chock full of dopamine neurons that impact motor functions or movement. And in Parkinson's disease, as you can see here in the highlighted area in red, those dopamine neurons start to die out and degenerate for reasons that we don't completely understand yet. Lastly, you guys, in our tour of the nervous system, I wanted to highlight the role of the peripheral nervous system, and in particular, the vagus nerve that you may have heard in, popular science, social media at the end of your yoga class. It's a very popular nerve these days, but it is a real one. It is your 10th cranial nerve. You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and vagus is the main parasympathetic nerve. So it is the longest of the 10th cranial nerve, extending from the base of your brain all the way down to your gut and your intestines, passing through every major organ in your body, like your lungs, your heart, your stomach, your liver, your spleen, your kidneys. Everything is touched by the vagus nerve, thus its name, the wanderer. Vagabond. It is an information superhighway. Most of its fibers, because it branches off, right? It's really a nerve bundle. Most of them are sensory nerve fibers, bringing in sensation. Let's say when you eat a lot and your stomach is distended, that mechanic receptor on the vagus nerve tells your brain, I'm full, right? But about 80% of its fibers are also motor fibers, allowing the brain to control, let's say, a heartbeat, for example. And so it is a key communicator in the gut-brain axis, producing The gut produces about 90% of the neurotransmitter serotonin in your body, and this is communicated to the brain via the vagus nerve. The vagus can also influence your heart rate and your heart rate variability, which are indicators of stress and how you can manage that and regulate your mood and well-being, hence that long exhale at the end of yoga class or while meditating. That helps to set your vagal tone. Lastly, you guys, to conclude, your brain and nervous system are highly dynamic and malleable. Your brain is extraordinarily complex, integrated, and dynamic. Understanding its anatomy is empowering. It gives you ways to influence your own mental and physical well-being, and it gives you power over neuroplasticity, your brain's ability to change and adapt throughout life. Thanks, everyone.